Okay, hello everyone, welcome back for talk number 2 with Rouzbeh Shadpey, who is an a-disciplinary artist and musician with a doctorate in medicine and inexhaustible exhaustion. His work explores decolonial pathophysiologies of illness and weariness, with a focus on the aesthetics and poetics of neuroimaging, diagnostics, and fatigue. He currently lives in Jojage, Muniang, Montreal. And so I'll just ask us to take like a moment of silence, and what you hear in the background is Rouzbeh's piece. So we'll just take a listen and then we'll get started.
Under a parabolic speaker lies a score, spread like a map on a low table. Occupying the lower left corner of this score, where one might expect to find a compass or cardinal system of directions, is a verse from a poem by the Jacobean metaphysical poet John Donne titled "Hymn to God in my sickness." It reads, "Since I am coming to that holy room, where, with thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music. As I come, I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then, think here before. Whilst my physicians by their love are grown cosmographers, and I, their map, who lie flat on this bed, that by them may be shown that this is my southwest discovery, per fretum febris, by these straits to die." Donne wrote this believing that he was to die, and in doing so, he intellectualized his death through the prism of cosmology, cartography, and developments in Renaissance science as a means to sublimate his death. Donne survived. But this work is neither about Donne's life nor his death, because what I am taking from Donne is a broader question. What does it mean to hear his words rather than read them on a page? A poem is not conceived to be read. It is conceived to be heard. And to grasp what a poem has to offer, we must read it aloud. Only through sounding does the poem reveal its cardinal directions to us, leading us through its straits. The sonic dimension of this work is silent, in the same way that the poem is silent without its activation. In other words, upon entering the work, your intuitive response is, of course, to listen to the piece and read the score. But you've been set up to fail. Because if you're trying to derive the meaning of this work solely from what you can listen to, you've missed the point. What you hear is a mundane soundscape. What you hear is a mundane soundscape of a brutal, negligent listening, one that exists within acoustic spaces of vulnerability, such as the telephonic police hold of the emergency health line, or the Mediterranean basin, and muffled cries for help by those who are made refugees in its crossing every day. The listening I am addressing in this work is a psychoacoustic deployment of whiteness, which polices the sound of racialized suffering and suffocates these sounds into silence. What you hear in the work is what I'm calling white acousmatic listening, and is a thread drawn from the resonance between two cases. Naomi Musenga's death in France, who was mocked and refused life-saving assistance by a white medical SAMU operator, and the drowning of over 350 Eritrean and Somali so-called migrants off the coast of the Italian island of Lampedusa, whose cries for help were mistaken by local yachters as the sound of a gaggle of seagulls. Both these cases took place within the hold of the acousmatic, a space where sound is divorced from sight and thus more susceptible to the fabulations of listening. Both these cases represent legal instances of non-assistance pour personne en péril, although only one of them is currently being tried as such in a court of law. Finally, both these cases resulted in fatal anti-Black violence perpetrated by the wistful deafness of white listeners. By These Straits to Die attempts the tracing of a cosmological map of this violent listening and its constellation of illness, health, song, and whiteness. It does this by extracting the comfort noise from the audio of Naomi Musenga's conversation with the SAMU operator, layering it with fragments of Olivier Messiaen's L'Abîme des Oiseaux, fragments whose final note is abruptly interrupted by the please hold message and resumed in the form of the hold tone. These cycles of 3 minutes and 4 seconds, the length of Naomi Musenga's call, orbit 30 times before beginning anew, endlessly. I end with a quote from P. Khalil Saucier in Tryon P. Woods, who remind us that there are no mistakes in the methodological workings of structural anti-Blackness. Only, quote, the refusal to believe and to know, or more so, the desire to misrecognize Black suffering naturalized as so much wildlife, end quote. And indeed, what is hearing, if not the expression of a desire under the guise of acoustic experience? Thank you.
No, thank you. I think that was a very, I don't know, I think I'm still processing what I heard in the theme of listening.
Yeah.
When we were talking the other night at the vernissage, like I had this like really macabre joke that might be insensitive. If it is, like strike it from the record. I didn't say it. You saw nothing, heard nothing. But it was very like, if a person of color cries for help and only white ears hear it, doesn't make a sound.
Yeah.
And I feel like that, like going back to some of your previous works on this one, and also from like what you just like recited, it really does sort of feel that way. That like the sound spaces are extremely non-neutral, biased, violent, and I think that you found a really like powerful way to get to like a lot of these like complexities of like, you know, when listening becomes violent, I don't think we think of listening typically as an act of violence. Often speaking as the way that like, you know, we use words to harm each other, the ways that even inadvertently words harm by being inherently like anti-Black or ableist, misogynistic, these kinds of things. But listening, which feels like a very passive practice, can also be, quite violent as you explored. Yeah. Not a question, just an observation.
No, I mean, no, you're absolutely right with all of that. I think, you know, the tree in the forest metaphor is quite apt. I agree with you. Because sound isn't this material entity, this physical entity, which is what a lot of sound art and sound studies makes it to be, right? Explores the material dimensions of sound, spatial dimensions of sound. But sound can't exist without a listener. And for me, it was important to make this work, which deals with a very violent topic, but to make it without making a spectacle of the sound of suffering itself. Because the perpetrator here is the listening, is the pathological listening of the white acousmatic listener. And so then the question became, how do you make a sound work about listening? How do you make listening audible? And what I found was that the sound of this violent listening was absolutely mundane. And maybe this echoes back to some of what Lauren was saying, this mundanity of the brutality of systems of violence and the way they trap us in them and the way they keep us in their holds, whether it's through bureaucracy, the paperwork of bureaucracy, or the sound of bureaucracy, which is the sound of the police hold. Yeah. And one thing I will say is that, so I come from a medical background. You mentioned that in my bio. After that, I did a BFA in electroacoustic music. So I was kind of immersed in this world of sound studies and sound art, which is white as fuck. Like, it's insane how white this field is. And I couldn't shake the fact that 1 out of 3 pieces of sound art was about listening to birdsong. Like, it was literally these installations these people make, putting birdsong in a white cube, and then telling us how it's about the importance of listening to the post-human Anthropocenic voice. I was like, okay, that's fucking great, but like, what happens when we get so good at it that we actually hear the birdsong instead of the cries for help of those refugees, so-called refugees, right? Where's the failure here? How do we address it? So yeah, there was that too, that kind of.
Yeah, I think what you just mentioned is a very interesting sort of like practice in like selective listening, and how, like in many other areas of life, like, you know, your options for selection is either greatly expanded on or limited by, you know, various like identities, experiences, social locations, this kind of thing. And I think your piece does a really interesting job at like making everyone who listens like implicit in this, this sort of like act of violent listening, even if the piece itself is not like overtly violent. Like, I think that also was a really like important choice, since often Black and brown suffering is used as like, especially in the white cube, it's sort of like shocking trauma porn, like, oh, look how bad things are elsewhere, and therefore how lucky we have it here, even though people here too have it pretty bad. This is not I'm just gonna say the word segue into the score. If you haven't seen it yet, in the area with the sound sound installation, there is like a table they had made with the visual representation of the score, which I think too, kind of like the sound piece itself, is like very beautiful in its arrangement. And you really see like the spirals of the loop of the sound. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that came about, or how you put a visual to the audio?
Yeah. As I mentioned at the beginning of that little thing I wrote, the score was a kind of influence and a tribute to John Donne, who is this metaphysical poet whose verse lends a name to the piece, By These Straits to Die. And Donne in the poem is describing, he's in this moment of serious illness where he thinks he's going to die, and he's describing his experience. And, you know, this is in the 16th century, where you had the Copernican revolution, you had these scientists, cosmographers that were making these maps, but that weren't just maps of oceans and territory and land that we see now, but that there were maps that both encompass the heavens and the earth, right? There were cosmological maps. And they were all fashioned with these eccentric circles representing different orbits of planets. And Donne explains this moment where he's seriously ill and he's on his deathbed, and he compares it to being laid down like a map. And he talks about his doctors that are treating him, his physicians, as being cosmographers that are reading this map of his life and death. And it just felt like that was the missing connection between illness and health, you know, in the case of Naomi, and then the kind of geospatial reality that those so-called refugees and migrants we're trapped and perished in, this Mediterranean basin that becomes this suffocating reservoir of sound that never reaches our ears. And when it does, it reaches it as birdsong. So that was kind of the missing connection there. And the circle, as you say, the piece is a 3-minute and 4-second loop that keeps on looping and orbiting. And it felt right to have this as a stamps on a circle. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Rouzbeh. I would love to pass it on if there are any questions from people who are here. I will come pass you the mic.
Thank you for listening.